The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to our 2017 webinar series, third installment, Integrating Trauma-Informed Care into Employment Services. My name is Tara McGuire, and I'm with Heartland Alliance's National Initiatives on Poverty and Economic Opportunity. On behalf of national initiatives and our presenters, we are very pleased that you are joining us today. Before we begin, a few housekeeping points. Everyone listening to the webinar is muted. You can use the chat box on your control panel, as pictured on the slide, to send questions for panelists at any point during the webinar. We will receive them and direct them to the appropriate presenter to answer during our Q&A session. You can type questions into the chat box at any time. The Q&A will occur at the end of the webinar. If there are any questions we don't get to, we will try to answer them via email afterwards. The slides and recording will be available on our website after today's webinar as well. And finally, we'll be using the hashtag TICWorks, that's TIC for Trauma-Informed Care Works. So please join us in tweeting about the webinar and use our hashtag. We've got a great group of speakers today, and I'll be handing it off to them shortly so that they can tell us more about trauma-informed care, and its applications in working with youth experiencing homelessness and people returning from incarceration. First, here's some introductory material about us, Heartland Alliance's National Initiatives on Poverty and Economic Opportunity. We are dedicated to ending chronic unemployment and poverty and work at the intersection of practice, policy, and research to catalyze change that is practical, informed by evidence, and grounded in the experiences of providers and advocates across the country. Our initiatives include the National Transitional Jobs Network and the National Center on Employment and Homelessness, which houses our Connections Project work, as was highlighted in recent webinars. We recently published a report on integrating rapid rehousing and employment services, which you can download for free on our website. And now I would like to introduce our first speaker, James Kowalsky. James is the project coordinator for the Heartland Center for Systems Change at Heartland Health Outreach, HHO, in Chicago, Illinois. Since 2014, James has been providing training and support to organizations adapting their practices to incorporate harm reduction, housing first, motivational interviewing, and trauma-informed care. He helped to develop HHO's overdose prevention, recognition, and response policy, which increased access to the life-saving drug naloxone, or Narcan, for HHO participants and staff. He has since helped other organizations replicate this policy. James is currently collaborating on a NIDA-funded study to assess the impact of distance learning for programs using the Housing First model. James spent 7 years as an outreach worker with HHO, meeting people experiencing homelessness and linking them to housing, primary and mental health care, and other community-based resources. In that role, he learned the value of using harm reduction and trauma-informed care to connect with the most vulnerable members of our communities. James facilitates a weekly Seeking Safety group for participants in HHO's psychosocial rehabilitation program, focusing on the intersection of trauma and substance use. James has presented on his work with HHO at regional and national conferences. James is committed to promoting a shift in public health policy characterized by acceptance and support for marginalized communities, including people who use drugs, have a mental illness, or experience homelessness. For more information on training and consultation services, please visit midwestharmreduction.org. And now I'll hand it off to James to get us started.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us wherever you are joining from. I just want to say I'm really grateful to have an opportunity to talk to everyone today about trauma-informed care. I am going to try to move a little bit quickly just to make sure we have time to get to the other panelists, because I think they have some really great material to share as well. And thank you to all of you for taking the time out. Thank you to National Initiatives for helping put on this webinar. So we can move ahead on the next slide. This is my contact information. Tara gave me a really good introduction already, so I won't talk any more about my background, but if you do have any questions specifically for me that don't get answered during the Q&A portion at the end, feel free to reach out to me via email or cell phone or Twitter. So next slide. So the Midwest Harm Reduction Institute, I'll just give a quick plug for some of the work we do here. Our fee-for-service training and technical assistance arm is called the Midwest Harm Reduction Institute, and you can get up with us on Twitter or Facebook or our website, and we even have a blog with some information that I think is really helpful for working in housing first programs. I think that also could be really useful for employment service providers as well. What I will say, and I think will come through in several of the presentations today, is I think often we think about harm reduction as being about syringe exchange and overdose, and I think it is very valuable for those purposes, but I think what we'll talk a little bit about today is how, and this was actually a theme of our conference a few years ago, but harm reduction is not just about drugs, and how harm reduction lessons can actually be applied to working with people who have experienced trauma. So you can go to the next slide. I'd like to just talk real quick. I think more and more we're hearing people talk about trauma-informed care, and it's been present, I think, in a lot of social service agencies for a while, but even in a broader context than that, I hear people talking about what does it mean to have trauma-informed communities and trauma-informed cities. So I think, more and more people are talking about being trauma-informed care, and it is becoming a little bit of a buzzword. So as a, quick general statement, being trauma-informed does not mean that we are informed on every traumatic thing that has ever happened to our participants. So don't feel like being trauma-informed means you need to dig into the traumatic details of people's past. Trauma is really defined by the response, not the traumatic event itself. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. In general, why we use trauma-informed care in our programs is particularly when we work with marginalized communities, when we work in homelessness, or when we work with people experiencing poverty, that we work from the assumption that every single person we encounter has experienced trauma at some point in their life. And working from that perspective sets us up to engage with people in a way that promotes recovery. We'll move to the next slide here. So this is a nice definition and overview from SAMHSA about what a trauma-informed care program or system looks like. And as a guideline, what I would say, and this will, I think, be a theme throughout all the presentations, is in general, when we're trying to engage with someone who has experienced trauma, there's three pillars of what we can do to support them. And that includes promoting safety, providing healthy connection, and giving people an opportunity to take control back in their lives. And so you can sort of see that throughout this definition, but you'll see it, I think, in other material we share today. So just to go through these really quickly, we realize the widespread impact of trauma and the potential paths for recovery. So we work from the assumption everyone has experienced trauma. We recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system. So I think, really important, we'll talk about what some of the symptoms and signs of traumatic exposure are in our participants today. But also, as a side note, we won't get into too much self-care work today, but important to note, trauma and our exposure to working with people who have experienced trauma does have an impact on the staff, on ourselves as well. And so we need to be keen for those signs in ourselves as well. We respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. So I think oftentimes when people think about trauma-informed care, they think it has to be some big fundamental shift in every single thing we're doing. And I think part of what it begins with is noticing the little things that we can do that are trauma-informed care. There are, in our small interactions, in our brief interactions with people, when someone gets greeted at the front door to the experience of sitting down for an assessment, we have opportunities to show that we are trauma-informed in all of those engagements. And I think my co-presenters will share some good details about that as well. So even policies, to me, like privacy and confidentiality, are very trauma-informed because they do promote safety and connection, healthy connection and control. And along with that, we seek to actively resist re-traumatization. I think important for us to recognize that It is not possible to avoid re-traumatization at all times, but as much as possible, we make efforts to resist and avoid re-traumatization. Next slide here. So I think just important as a general overview, many people when they hear trauma, at least especially with our participants even, when they've experienced trauma, they don't necessarily identify it as such. So it's important that we define what we mean when we say trauma. And first off, it does include physical harm, which I think participants more readily recognize, but it also includes emotionally harmful events. So really, trauma is any event or group of events that either happen to an individual or a group of individuals, and then has some type of lasting effect on that individual's functioning. And that could be social or emotional, could be their general well-being, and their ability to kind of move through life. So trauma, it kind of overwhelms the person and makes it difficult to move through life in the same way. Next slide here. This is just a definition. So, traumatic events are things that are sudden, unexpected, and perceived as dangerous. And I mentioned already, but a threat to one's physical or mental well-being through violence or the threat of violence. And what that means is really, there's a line between stress and trauma. When you have a bunch of papers due and you got to get your progress notes in on time, that can be really stressful, but not traumatic, right? Traumatic is something that poses a serious threat to us, and trauma usually is something that will kick us into our fight, flight, or freeze mode. So in that way, it is overwhelming. So, you're more reacting than you are consciously trying to respond, and it makes an individual unable to manage their daily business as a result. So that could be, if you've ever had a close call or gotten into like a car accident on your way to work, it makes it very hard to then function that day. Also important, traumatic events are subjective and defined by the survivor's experience. We don't totally understand why, but we do know that not everyone who experiences a traumatic event experiences post-traumatic stress from it. And so, there's research happening about why that is, but that's why it's so important that we work from the general approach that all people have experienced trauma. And typically, traumatic events are things that are either directly experienced, witnessed, or learned about by an individual. So if you had someone who was very close to you and you learned that something bad had happened to them or a traumatic event had occurred to them, that would also constitute a traumatic event. So you can go to the next slide here. Now, usually when I have more time, I like to spend some time sinking into this slide and talking about all the different things that occur in our participants' life that can be traumatic. We don't really have time for that today, so I'll try to simplify this one, but this is not an exhaustive list. This is, and I'm sure as you all look over the list of traumatic events here, probably a lot of this speaks to the experiences that you've seen in participants you've worked with. And so I think some of the things that are most important to point out here are really, for me, what sticks out is all these events that can be traumatic. What I notice about them when I look over this list is how one makes you more likely to experience another and another and another. And that's really part of the risk of traumatic events and also traumatic symptoms, is that they set people up for continued and repeated exposure to trauma. So if we just take something like a lot of my experience has been in working with homelessness, that when someone experiences homelessness, they're at greater risk of verbal and physical abuse. They're at greater risk for domestic violence or some type of sexual abuse. They're at greater risk for incarceration by living on the streets. So all of these kind of compound on top of each other. And so I think that's kind of the main takeaway from this slide. So again, with all of these, we know that our participants come to us with these experiences. It's not so much that we ask for the gory details about exactly what happened in that moment. Really, that is the work of trauma therapists, not of people in other fields, in case management or in employment services. But important to know that these are some of the experiences our participants come to us with. Next slide. Yes. So you know how people say sticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never hurt you? We really need to tell people to stop saying that, because it's not true. In fact, words really do harm. And in some ways, there's actually research now that shows that verbal abuse may actually be more harmful in terms of traumatic stress than physical abuse. Because when you break a bone, your bone heals, you get better, you recognize that you have the strength to recover. When there's a threat held over your head and that threat never comes to a reality, you just live with that constant fear. There's no part of you that knows, okay, if this occurs, I'll be okay. You just sort of are stuck in that state of fear. And so not only do words certainly hurt people, but I think we should recognize that the words that we use when we communicate with people show a lot about the way that we view them and the way that we think about them and the potential that we believe that they have. So our words really matter as well. Next slide. So Judith Herman wrote the book Trauma and Recovery, and just so you know, there's the last slide I think I have in here has some information, resources, books that I think are really useful, websites as well. But Judith Herman is one of the foundational authors on this subject, and this is just a quotation of hers. So from the book Trauma and Recovery. So traumatic events call into question basic human relationships. They breach the attachments of family, friendship, love, and community. I think what makes trauma's impact so lasting is the way that it really violates our sense of fairness in the world, our sense of how things are supposed to go, and it makes it difficult to move through life after that. And so one of the things that we talk about, and we'll come back to this later, but one of the themes of trauma-informed care is to move beyond just what's wrong with this person, and then to shift our thinking to what happened to this person. Next slide. So I mentioned, when we go into a traumatic event, that what happens is we go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. That is a natural human response. That is a healthy response. And part of what happens is our brain is making different choices in those moments than it would otherwise. So one of the things that our brain does is it turns off, or it reduces the amount of energy going to our cortex. And our cortex is responsible for high processing activity. So things like logic, judgment, language, empathy, our ability to connect with other people, those resources are not as important when we're in a life or death moment. And so our limbic system sort of takes control in that moment. And after the stress passes, our brain tells our body we're safe now and we can calm down. Now, what happens with people who experience post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder is the brain never stops the alarm. Your nervous system continues to respond as if the threat is still there. And, whether someone, meets criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder or not, most people will experience some form of post-traumatic stress following a traumatic event. It's just a question of how severe and how impactful it is on their functioning. So I have a lot more I could say about the brain, but no time to talk about it now. So we'll just go to the next slide. This is just so this is the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And like I said, we don't want to limit our trauma-informed work to just people who come to us with a diagnosis of PTSD, but useful for us to know that these are how someone gets these are the symptoms how someone gets diagnosed with PTSD. So that would be things like intrusion, so re-experiencing, and that happens through nightmares and flashbacks, avoidance of stimuli, and so that looks like either staying away from people or places that remind you of the event, or trying to avoid really strong emotions. Hyperarousal, kind of being constantly on guard, on edge, really jumpy and jittery. Negative cognitions and mood. And so that looks like a lot of things. It could be feelings of depression, feelings of hopelessness, of isolation. And so some of the other ones listed on here, loss of interest in activities, problems with memory, and feelings of blame and guilt. And so that can look like people feeling ashamed that they didn't do more to stop the traumatic event from happening, that those are really common responses in those situations. It becomes PTSD, and so, as you look at this list, people can experience these things after a traumatic event occurs, but it becomes PTSD when you have these 4 symptoms present over the course of a full month, and it interrupts functioning in some way. So next slide. So I think it's really important, and one of the most important things I can say is that we broaden what we look for when we think about traumatic symptoms. And so while, diagnostically in the DSM, you'd be looking for these, 4 symptom clusters to diagnose PTSD. What we as service providers can look for is much broader. And so, everyone experiences trauma differently, but oftentimes people who are exhibiting trauma symptoms typically will present in one of 4 ways. And we kind of generalize that as sad, mad, bad, or I've been had. And it can look, people can fluctuate between these at different times. But just to give you a sense, sad could be the symptoms of depression. Mad could be, feeling totally paranoid, kind of having a preoccupation with the perpetrator or some repetitive thoughts about that person. Bad would be either anger and rage, but also a lot of risk-taking behavior, running away or truancy in youth. So those would be some examples there. And in the I've been had, difficulty setting long-term goals. When you feel like it's hard to think 5-10 years ahead, because what's the point of thinking that far ahead when anything can come along and take advantage of you? Anyone can come along and knock you off your square, essentially. That you can't trust people and trust things to go the way they're supposed to go. Makes it really hard to set long-term goals. And I mentioned, the alarm keeps going off. So people are often quick to jump into fight or flight mode when it's not even necessary. So either they don't recognize the danger that they're putting themselves into, or they get into, because of hyperaggression, because of that sense of the alarm always going off, they jump into fighting mode, even when they don't need to. And if you've ever been sitting having a conversation with someone, engaging with them like you would with anyone else, and they kind of get really offended and upset and start trying to jump down your throat and start accusing you of harassing them or attacking them, oftentimes that is a sign of trauma. And so the next slide has some more details about that as well. So this is part of a full handout, which I believe we can make available if you haven't received it already, but about how trauma reactions can explain some of the challenging behaviors that we see in social service settings. So, when someone is constantly getting into fights and appears agitated, that could be connected to the traumatic symptom or the traumatic response of irritability and the outbursts of anger and rage. If someone has difficulty keeping up in job training programs, that might be due to changes in their cognition. So they might have trouble concentrating or remembering material. When people have difficulty getting motivated for either keeping up with things, that might be a sign of the depression that they're experiencing. And then I think another really serious one for people once they enter into the workforce is, and I've experienced this a lot with some of the folks I've worked with, is they are triggered when dealing with authority figures. So an authority figure is essentially taking control away from them, forcing them to make certain choices, and that can produce really strong responses in people who have experienced trauma. Next slide. This is from handout. The link for the full handout is also in the back of the slides, but these are just some of the suggestions of specific to the employment support context of things that providers can do to try to help people who've experienced trauma. So that includes just discussing trauma with them, talking about common responses to trauma, and sort of normalizing and validating what they experience. Helping people identify possible triggers in the workplace, essentially anticipating what might set them off before it comes up. Strengthening skills like grounding techniques. So giving people ways to essentially manage and navigate the intense emotions that come along with having a traumatic experience or being re-traumatized and triggered by that, and how to manage that in a way where it doesn't require them disconnecting and becoming avoidant altogether but actually being able to stay present in the moment. Developing community partnerships. So, when we do realize that people need additional supports, that we seek out the experts in trauma in our communities and try to provide that support. And then I think last, reflecting on the impact of secondary trauma. So again, how does trauma impact us? How does it affect us as the helpers to constantly be exposed to people who are, in some cases still going through trauma? That does have an impact on us. We have to be connected and compassionate and caring about the people who we serve. And if we're not doing it right. And so I think that is, it's going to take a toll on us. And I think that's something we need to be mindful of. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, cool. So this is a nice acronym. It wouldn't be a social service training without at least one acronym. So RICH is your acronym for today. So some of the things that trauma-informed emphasizes: respect, and that looks like, again, you see prioritizing safety, choice, and control, but also respect for people's viewpoint, respect for the choices that they want to make. Information, which includes building up the resources people have at their disposal. Connection, and how do we essentially, you know, people have learned traumatic responses from what the world has given them. And the only way they learn something different is by experiencing something different. So we have to ourselves provide very healing and healthy, powerful relationships where we connect with the people who we serve, and hope. And I think that means we have to be hopeful for our participants and all that they're capable of doing. So the next slide. This is a nice big image, and I do not have time to talk about all of it today, but I think a few of the themes that you'll see, you know, on the left are kind of what a non-trauma informed approach looks like, and on the right is what a trauma informed approach looks like. And you'll see a lot of the themes echoed here. So safety is a big thing. So people need, as opposed to people need fixing first, people need safety first. Before people can do anything else, they need to feel safe. And so how do we help people feel safe when they come into our programs? You know, the idea of the goal is to do things the right way. Well, actually the goal for us is to connect, right? There is no particular right way that someone has to do things. That's really for them to determine. And so that speaks to both connection and control. And then you see a lot of these talk about the idea of giving control to the participants. So instead of being didactic and telling people what to do, that it's participatory. Instead of being prescriptive, that we offer people choice. Power with, the idea of empowerment and collaboration, all these themes kind of repeated throughout. And I think really the hopeful message here, up at the top there, you see your brain is plastic, right? So all these traumatic experiences and traumatic symptoms that people have in their lives, that they can change. And our relationships and the work that we do with them can help people make those changes. So the next slide is just the references and resources that I mentioned. And then the last slide here is, I will just point out, so the ACE study is something to consider. And Matt Bennett's from Cold Spring Center does a great blog. He talks a lot about trauma, and he's actually doing a lot right now about secondary trauma and self-care. And so then this is the just a flyer if you're feeling like making a trip to Chicago early fall, late summer. We host a conference every year in September. And so that's all for me.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for that overview, James. That was fantastic. And yeah, now I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Craig Lahti. Craig is the Associate Director of Larkin Street Academy, providing workforce development and education services to homeless and at-risk youth in San Francisco and the Bay Area. Craig has been with Larkin Street for 6 years. In that time, he has been working in workforce development services with the youth Larkin Street serves in varied roles. Having provided one-on-one counseling and housing sites, served as a classroom instructor, created programs through curriculum development and connecting services, and working to integrate engagement, education, and employment services into a unified practice. Craig assisted in the development of Larkin Street's current working models for workforce programming, from expanding the total number of national or state certificates offered through training to curriculum development in Larkin Street's pilot learning center in 2014. Craig also oversees the Youth Force experiential work program, as well as Larkin Street's internship programming, and has sought to bring practical and progressive job readiness training in an in-practice model to help youth move into career focuses and supportive employment. Yeah, and with that, I'll hand it off to Craig.
Well, thank you, Tara. I appreciate, hope everybody can hear me, and thank you all for joining us here at this webinar. So, yeah, as was said, I'm Craig Lahti. I work with Larkin Street Youth Services. I have been for quite a number of times. Larkin Street, for those of you who don't know, is a San Francisco-based homeless and at-risk for homelessness youth engagement program services. So, the overall mission for Larkin Street is to create a continuum of services that inspire youth to move beyond the street. We will nurture potential, promote dignity, and support bold steps by all. And the biggest point that I have to make for our mission is that, our mission derived 33 years ago out of the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco, which is a historically impoverished neighborhood. And in that neighborhood, the founders of Larkin Street saw a lot of rampant drug use and what we call survival sex trade with the young people in that community. And they wanted to do something about it. And with that, they, the models at the time were really, really adamant about absolute abatement of sort of those things, the traditional 12 steps, et cetera. And they said, well, what can we do to make sure that we can increase the safety of the young people in this neighborhood? And that's really where Larkin Street got its footing. Next slide. So we address homelessness and the risk of homelessness with our young folks in our full continuum of care. And that goes from that point of entry. We have multiple points of entry for our services, as simple as simply just walking in and saying, can I have some food? Beyond that, we want to make sure that we're getting young people into that basic needs assistance. So, food and hygiene supply, and then of course, healthcare services. We provide on-site clinic services as well as behavioral health services. And then moving on, going into housing, moving on, going into education, employment, moving on, going into off the street. And the point really to note here is that the services for employment in young people with regard to trauma-informed care, we don't just stay with employment as our only service. And there are a lot of organizations that are employment focused, and that's really all they do. They don't provide housing, they don't provide health services, et cetera. But the crux here is to make sure that there is a connection to other agencies that do those sorts of things. So if you're not in the same scope of Larkin Street to be able to provide all of those in-house, in order to truly be addressing a young person's trauma, we have to be able to address every element of trauma that can come about to them before we can really get them moving on to focus on their embetterment through employment. If you think back to early psych and social classes to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that physiological needs base needs to be met before we can really start looking at advancement up the pyramid. Next slide. So this is just a quick overview of all of our programs and services, and I'm not going to read everything, but the point here is that you can see that there's this multi-facets of every aspect we've got. From our point of entry, which involves an outreach team that goes and finds young people where they're at on the street, to our engagement and community center, which is a no-barrier center for young people to access and receive basic needs services. Similarly to our Haight Street Referral Center, just a different population of young people who are in that area. Our health services, as I said, we have a medical clinic on site. We have an HIV specialty clinic. We work with mental health. And then going into our education and employment, we have our Larkin Street Academy. Larkin Street Academy really is a focused effort for us to brand education and employment as a single service rather than two separate services. And in that, we're really trying to make sure that as young people are coming into education and employment services, they have a focus on what career track they're going to develop, not necessarily just what job they're going to get tomorrow. And then, of course, we have a multitude of housing services. Any given night, Larkin Street sleeps about 240 young people, everything from emergency housing to transitional-based housing that lasts about 2 years. And so, again, the all-encompassed focus of making sure that we're addressing all of those basic needs is really kind of one of the best things we can do to make sure that we're being as trauma-informed as we can to prevent and to prevent that re-traumatization that homelessness provides. Next slide. So for here, the kind of the cogs of the gear that turn, we talk a little bit about what our education and employment services are. The big wheel being our career tracks focus, our career planning focus, and our employment supportive of education. Conceptually, like I said, our focus is to make sure that young folks are getting into those larger tracks and sets. For us, that can involve employment as a baseline and an engagement level activity. That can be our youth force program, our employment training program, also called ETP, where we offer certificates, nationally recognized, state recognized, and career track aligned. Not necessarily a career track in themselves all the time, but really aligned to make sure that young people could either move up into a particular field or be supported while they go to school to move up in another field. And then we have, again, our learning center model, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of these and how they're all designed to address trauma-informed care. But the kind of best thing I can talk about as far as blending goes is that in our education services, where we help with high school diplomas, GEDs, college, all of these components have a bit of the other in them. So our youth force program has education training in it. Our employment training program has a tutor that comes into the class. Our learning centers do a phenomenal amount of work over 6 months to make sure that young people can get employment and education needs met at the same time. And that blended model, that blended learning model, is really where we're doing what we can to focus on addressing every element of a young person's needs so that they can be as successful as possible with regard to their pursuit of education and employment. Next slide. So our program philosophy here, success has a different meaning for every young person. We can't decide what success is for everyone who walks through our doors. And in fact, with trauma-informed care, you'll see that you simply can't be the decision maker for the people you're trying to assist. It has to be collaborative. They have to input the values that they have right now at this time. And that way we can support the best pathway to success, and we can offer advisements or feedback, but we do that through a number of methods, primarily using harm reduction and motivational interviewing to make sure that when youth are working towards employment and education goals, that they are receiving feedback from their counselors or from their case managers in a way that supports them making decisions for themselves rather than ascribing decisions to them. Next slide. And we're going to be able to do that by acknowledging a couple things. One is the stages of change. Stages of change is a model I'm hoping most people are fairly familiar with, but I'm going to talk briefly about what it is. I mean, stages of change talks about a person's decision-making process, and that decision-making process to address a behavior specifically. And with regard to harm reduction and trauma, it sort of comes to this track that, if somebody is not in a mindset or in a personal space to make any change and doesn't want to address that, doesn't trust enough to start working on addressing that, or doesn't have enough feeling of internal support or self-confidence to start addressing that, they'd be in what we call pre-contemplation phase. And the point of pre-contemplation is to say, this is somebody who's really not acknowledging that they want to adjust anything in their lifestyle. And so if you start trying to really give advice and really start focusing on informing somebody what you maybe think they should do, it's going to kind of fall a little bit on deaf ears, and that, in this stage of somebody's life, they're not going to have a consideration to just say, okay, yeah, great, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to start working on things. You need to be at this point really working with people on building trust and building an established relationship and having the ability to have one-on-one conversations, even if it's something simplistic. My employment counselors go to our engagement sites all the time and just get to know young people. They don't show up with agendas. They don't show up to say, well, we're trying to recruit for this class and everybody sign up now and we'll pay you this, award or stipend if you do. They just show up and they say, hi, who are you? My name is, and they start developing relationships. Moving through stages of change, we go to contemplation, where somebody is maybe willing to engage in those conversations. Preparation, where somebody's possibly decided to start making or taking steps towards an improvement in kind of their situation, as well as then action, of course, is when they've made that decision to do and start participating in a thing. And then maintenance is when you're talking about, of course, keeping them successful in the action and decision that they've made. And you'll notice on the right there, there's that indication that there's a potential for relapse. And relapse does come up, and it is something that we need to acknowledge as, somebody could be on a good track and then something else in their life happens. Some other trauma comes in and it can cause a bit of a backslide in behavior. And rather than saying that that's a failure, we just have to really look at it and say, how can we get that behavior focused back and acknowledge what step they end up in after that sort of a relapse. So again, it's taking where somebody is at in an analyzed and deliberate approach to make sure that we're focused on an individual and their personal needs, not necessarily the agency's intended outcomes for them. So next slide. In an employment kind of translation for this, when you're working with somebody in the stages of change with regard to employment, here we'd say, maybe in pre-contemplation, working is not on their mind. They could be resistant to discussion, or they often make these grandeur statements, which are that I do enough working on the street. I've got my hustle going. It's okay. I can do this till I don't need to anymore, or I could get a job if I wanted to. I just don't feel like working for the man, or something similar. And in those cases, again, it's really about relationship-based building. If they move on to that contemplation area, that's that persuasion stage. If they're considering employment in their own life and talking about work, that's where the concentration should be focused on. Like, well, what do you want to do? How? Where would you see yourself working? What would the cost to your personal life be to have a job that was, 40 hours a week? What would the benefit be? In that preparation step, then taking that personal assessment of that self to plan for the pursuit of work. Here we can look at what vocational planning we could do if they have an intention. A lot of young people are hearing nowadays and throughout the country that the only way to be successful is to have a 4-year degree. And while that is a definite plan for success, and Larkin Street encourages everybody to pursue post-secondary education, there are also other variations of post-secondary education, whether that be a career and technical education, a certificate program that provides a career track analysis, or any kind of background in something that's going to be able to pay them a sustainable wage. And so going on from there, we'll look at our action plan, and we're really looking to a client exiting one of our training programs if they've pursued some sort of career technical education and enter that employment and start working competitively for an employer. Maintenance then becomes remaining attached to that young person and that workforce provider, so that we can have conversations, so that if anything pops up for that young person on the job, we can start addressing it as a team. Next slide. So harm reduction strategies for us in employment to make sure that we're addressing trauma. We work to minimize harmful behaviors rather than ignore or condemn them. We cannot simply say that harm reduction and trauma-informed care is not acknowledging when they are engaged in actions that's going to be harmful to themselves. We need to be able to have those conversations, and those conversations are going to be the thing that really establishes the work that we're doing, rather than saying, well, this is what I'm telling you to do, and this is what's going to make you successful. We need to actually engage and say, do you feel that the behavior that you're engaging with right now is going to help you to be successful as you've expressed to me? Making sure we're concentrating on empathy and not pity. And then rolling with resistance. If they decided that they're no longer interested in having that communication, we need to kind of step back and kind of recircle the wagons to figure out where we can enter that communication again. And again, as we pointed out, this whole method is a continuum behavior, not necessarily a straight line. So our goals and values and behavior always need to be evaluated and analyzed for change, because they will adjust. Somebody who's identified their goal as getting a $100,000 a year job, well, if their behavior is to engage in marijuana use 24 hours a day, that probably doesn't align to that goal, and we need to be able to have that conversation with them. Using non-judgmental or non-coercive provision of services and resources. I don't withhold services for young people who are not engaged in particular activities. None of us do. But we offer different services for people who are willing to engage in higher levels or higher functions of productive behavior. And that's really where showing options to what young people can have access to and be able to give them a try at every time. You know, when we have a young person, if they haven't expressed an ability to follow through on a long-term commitment, such as one of our learning center programs might be, it doesn't mean we're not going to allow them to give it a shot, but we want to make sure that we're communicating the expectations of such a program really clearly when they come in, and so that if they are not successful at it, we can make sure that they have options to continue on unsuccessful behavior if that doesn't occur, so that they don't lose that momentum that they've been building. Obviously, avoiding arguing and direct confrontation is a key portion of this. We're going to recognize the realities of poverty, class, and racism, social isolation, all those things that trauma are resulting from, and then supporting our individual as well as a community of life. We focus a lot on building community. We have frequent community circles within all of our classes, all of our programs in our sites. And then making sure that youth voice and encourage their capacity to be responsible for shaping their workforce experience, meaning they've given input to what they want to do, and they give us input into how our classes are run. And then having that individualized work plan so that people are making sure that they've committed to their own planning for work and workforce development. Next slide. So tying it all together with education and employment, again, as I was stating, all of our programs have elements of education and employment within them, making sure that, you know, if we're addressing one, we're addressing the other. And if a young person has no intent for education, they at least can have the conversation. We want to create flexible plans to demonstrate milestone systems so that young people can see success. You know, motivation is a lot easier to maintain when you feel that the goals you're meeting are attainable. And if your goal is simply that $100,000 a year job coming straight in off the street, it may be difficult to really pursue that so quickly, but difficult to maintain that motivation unless you give people smaller steps to address along the way. Next slide. So to speak on our programs in their own capacity, you know, as an engagement level program, we have our Youth Force program, and this is a paid work program that's immediate. The expectation is that any young person who's expressed an interest in becoming an employee and in pursuing workforce development, they can get into this program within, you know, ideally 72 hours. We need to process their, you know, I-9 forms and the legal right to work, you know, issues that we have as an agency, but overall, we want to make sure that young people having this experience get a chance to what we call test the waters. They're going to be able to come into the program. They're going to have to wear work attire. They're going to get an opportunity to work 28 hours a week. They're going to have realistic consequences for their actions. You know, in a work program on the street, if a young person shows up and is intoxicated, we're going to send them home for the day. And then we're going to have a conversation with them after we do that. We can't have young people high at work, because it's not a realistic expectation of a workplace, but it doesn't mean that they're fired right that moment. We're going to have conversations and we're going to get them involved with understanding why we need to hold these particular lines and why we need to have these expectations for their safety as well as our own, and for the program's success as well as the individual success. You know, this opportunity gives them a lot of chance to start building experience for resumes, especially for those who've never had a job. Our staff will often serve as job references for them, and education planning is presented and included in the class. And we do these projects: street beautification, graffiti cleanup, pressure washing, landscaping. And really what we're trying to focus on is making sure that it's not that work, that graffiti cleanup, that's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to build soft skills and to build workplace expectations in a young person's mind. Because most of them, when they say, you know, what would help you getting off the street, they always say job and money. Next slide, please. Moving on into our employment training program, that one I noted as ETP. Again, this is for young people who maybe don't have the capacity to feel successful in an on-the-job experience. So this is also an engagement level program and an alternative to our Youth Force program. And it's more classroom related. Some young people are much more comfortable being able to sit and learn and get a focused sense of what being an employee is through a classroom environment rather than an experiential one. So we meet, you know, Monday through Friday, 9:30 to 2:30. They get paid an award for attendance, which is about $100 a week if they're attending full time. And the classroom covers our employment skills, life skills. We do a customer certification through the National Retailers Federation. And we align this to education and career goals. We talk to them about financial literacy. We talk to them about the expectations for education and the careers that they've expressed interest in. We work with workplaces to do job shadow experiences. We tour different employers that young people have expressed interest in, and we start really making sure that we can support them throughout their attendance in this class to make sure that they're starting off with a win. So again, it's really about focusing on what do we need to do to make sure somebody can finish and be successful, rather than really making it a course that they have to pass or something. It's really about what do we have to do to address their needs so that they can be as successful as possible in it. Next slide, please. Which then brings us to our focus on our learning centers. Our learning center model is one that really focuses on career tracks and career track exploration. Right now, we offer learning centers in healthcare, in information technology, and hospitality industries. And the reason we chose these tracks is they're often actually very high interest in advertised careers, especially advertised by for-profit education institutions. And what we found is a lot of our young folks are often seeing very, very wonderful advertisements on television and radio and feeling like this college is going to make them very successful. What they don't realize is that it's also going to be very, very expensive and eat up a lot of their eligibility for federal aid. And so what we try, and then they end up making decisions that they don't want to continue to pursue it. And so they'll attend for a semester, accumulate, $25,000, $28,000, $30,000 in debt, and not have much to show for it. And so what we do is we give a really well-rounded approach to learning, and a well-rounded approach to learning in these career tracks. And we do this with collaboration. So we work with the Mindfulness Campus of UCSF to do guided meditation and yoga and focused learning, so that young people can have a grounding experience while they're learning in these programs. We do a lot of experiential learning. So we work with Outward Bound, which is an organization that does team building and activity exercises. Our young people have gone kayaking, they've gone rock climbing, done a lot of other great things. Focused tutoring, we partner with Sylvan Learning Centers to do math education in a very, very supportive sense, and involve technology. So young people are really addressing, the subject of mathematics where they're at, which is online. And then career-based learning, as I said, healthcare, IT, hospitality. We offer certificates in all of these programs that are intro-level certificates for young people who have this interest. And at this point, if they then leave that learning center and decide, yes, I do want to continue on, we then have steps for them to take next. If they leave that learning center and they go, you know what, healthcare wasn't for me. I really don't think that I can handle the gore of being in a hospital. Then they haven't cost themselves any money. In fact, they get paid for their attendance, and they have had an opportunity to really gain some classroom experiences, which after all of our classrooms and education experiences, we'll go to our next slide and talk a bit about our supportive internships and building collaborations and what that means for us. We want to make sure that when young people leave training or leave a work program with Larkin Street, that they're moving on into either a career or a workplace that's going to be supportive for pursuit of a career. So leaving into an actual career developed workplace, or leaving into a workplace that's going to be understanding of a post-secondary schedule. So we offer internships as supportive exits. They could be 3 to 6 months, 10 hours a week to 32 hours a week. We pay them all on an hourly wage. And what we look to do with regard to making sure who we're connecting with regard to being employers is I ask my team to act like an employment agency, not a service center. When we contact a potential employer, we're not saying, hey, would you like to hire some of these poor, impoverished youth who just need your help? We say, we've got these youth who have been upskilled in these kind of classes or with this kind of training and have this kind of certificate and are in college or in pursuit of this particular certificate. Do you need employees like this? And do you also need employees who are going to have a supportive team ensuring that they're going to be successful, so that an employer knows that not only are they getting an employee who's got a baseline of training, but they've got a whole support network already, and in the Bay Area and across the country, when somebody doesn't have a support network, if they have something fall off, all of a sudden that could cost them the job. And then that means the employer's got to retrain somebody, got to hire again. And most employers want longevity with regard to their employees. We do a lot to invite employers to come in and conduct employment workshops with our youth. They train our youth. We work to make sure that we're partnering with vocational certificate programs. We work with a construction training program. We work with another healthcare academy that does registered nurse training. We also then have young people in their programs go out and volunteer at employer work sites so they can get an experience of just observing or shadowing or helping out with a volunteer effort that workplace is engaging in. So if the workplace is doing a community volunteer project, the young people will come out and then be able to meet the people they might be able to work with in an environment that's not necessarily that same workplace. We do try and focus on a range of opportunities and really work with collaborative partners and blended funding for these internships. But really the last thing we make sure to do is train our employers about how to work with homeless and at-risk youth, so that they understand that you're going to end up hiring TAY youth and homeless youth and at-risk youth because it's not on the application. Are you homeless? Are you TAY? But young people are a primary hiring pool, and the benefit we can offer them is we can train them in best practice on handling some of the problems that arise, and train them in best practice on how to address people's needs in a workplace and in an area of the country that can be quite challenging. And that's really all for me. I know there was a lot of information fairly quickly, so of course, if you next slide, have questions, I'm going to be available. There's my contact info. Feel free to reach out. And again, I would always love to be able to give people more of a base of information on the services Larkin Street provides and how we're doing so. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Craig. That was really informative. Thank you. Yeah, and I'd now like to introduce our final presenter, Debby Kratky. Debby Kratky is the Director of Capacity Building and Training for Workforce Solutions for Tarrant County. She has displayed her commitment to the people affected by homelessness and poverty for over 35 years. She has spearheaded many innovative local initiatives which have placed federal funds in the hands of community organizations that fight this battle daily. Debby is a subject matter expert for local, state, and national representatives on issues about ex-offenders reentry, welfare reform, homelessness and fatherhood programs, as well as families living in crisis. Debby has served as chair for the advisory board for the Tarrant County Department of Human Services, member of the executive board for the Tarrant County Homeless Coalition, and executive board for Tarrant County Reentry Coalition. She was co-founder of the Tarrant County Fatherhood Initiative, which is now fully operational and supported by the Texas Attorney General's Office for Services for Non-Custodial Parents. Recently, she also served on a subcommittee for the Tarrant County Criminal Justice Plan, examining best practices in jail diversion projects for Tarrant County. Ms. Kratky also served as past chairman for the National Transitional Jobs Network. She currently oversees several employment projects funded by the Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Human Services, Texas Workforce Commission, and the Texas Attorney General's Office. Her 20 years in workforce development has also made her a recognized expert on employment opportunities and career pathways leading to middle skills jobs. Yeah, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to Debby.
Well, thanks. I probably need to shorten that bio. I was being embarrassed by the end of it. My presentation today is really going to focus for those organizations who are perhaps just now trying to put trauma-informed care in the forefront of their programs. We've only been seriously looking at this for about 3 years, even though we've been serving people coming out of prison for almost 20 years. And it's been an eye-opening journey. Just when you think that you may have a grasp on everything you need to know about serving a particular population, you learn that there is something really important that you missed. And so I'm going to be talking to you in my short period of time about some of the things that we've learned recently in working around trauma-informed programming and reentry. Next slide. I want to talk first of all about the major changes we made in our competitive programs with the Department of Labor when it comes to reentry. We've also done this in the homeless community, but I think it goes very well in working with people right out of prison. I did want to say that the average time in jail or prison that a person has served in 3 of our major reentry programs have averaged from 30 to 40. So primarily those middle-aged individuals who've served more than 5 years in prison. Lots of things happen to an individual before prison and unfortunately during imprisonment. And those are some things that maybe the customer or the participant isn't even aware of. So what we decided to do is work with a licensed therapist on developing tools and assessments that would help not only the customer, but also help the staff who are working with that customer. Now, I have some of the actual assessment tools that we use on this screen. They are by far not all. Added to this list would be several different tools that we use around interest inventory, career pathways, as well as strengths finders from Gallup. And all of those put together make a pretty thorough assessment of that individual. Next slide. I want to talk about what that means and what it means to the individuals in the programs. First, after those assessments are done, the therapist we consult with prepares 2 separate packets. One packet goes to the staff. The other packet goes to the participant. And we don't just get the packet, we have to stamp those assessments. And we are very fortunate that the licensed therapist we partner with is also really good at teaching. So we staff each individual assessment package, looking at everything from cognitive functioning to possible trauma, and discuss it before we really begin working with that participant. During that same period of time, that same intensive staffing is done by the licensed therapist with the customers themselves. So they have a full understanding of what the results of those assessments were. During that period of time, we're also provided with workarounds. We're given in that packet some ideas to work with a customer if there are things like learning disabilities or a propensity for substance abuse, some of the things that we can do or assist with. We make then adjustments to all of our activities we're going to be doing from there forward with that participant based on the assessment results. We then our coaching team then debriefs with the participants. So there is a sharing or teaching with the staff, a sharing and teaching with the customer. Adjustments are then made, and then we do regular ongoing debriefings with that licensed therapist. Usually it's optimum if you can do that once a week. We also do individualized action plans with those coaching teams and our experts after the assessments are done, because we want to make sure that we're going to be assisting that customer in finding the job that's going to work best for them. Given all of the things that they've experienced, we want to make sure that the job we help them with is going to be meaningful and make a real difference in their lives. Next slide. As I said, we had 2 major changes in the way we decided to do business, and the assessment was the first. The second big change that we've done is to look at the coaching method versus case management, or coaching versus social work. And in employment specifically, we really do believe that the coaching model best fits what we need to do. And consequently, it goes hand in hand with the literature that we found on working with participants who have experienced trauma. It is second nature, I think, for most social workers to be really great case managers, to do provide instruction and navigation, assisting the customer in getting to their next steps. And although that's quite good, we can also fall back on that style that really tells rather than asks. So we decided that our emphasis was going to be on the coaching model And that model really says decisions are going to be focused on the client's present state and then look at where the client wants to go in the future. Not where the job developer necessarily wants them to go, not where a case manager tells them where they need to go, but really the decision is made in a partnership, not as a case manager versus a customer. So that clients and coaches work more as partners, and that really does, I think, bring a lot to the table. They provide guidance. They're going to provide supportive resources, but they're also going to provide a level of accountability. And we expect our participants to do the same. These coaches then serve as a guide, and with the real purpose and goal of giving that client the confidence they're going to need to come up and make their own decisions in the right way. The coach then serves as a facilitator and a motivator and a supporter and an account holder. We're going to hold them accountable, but we're also going to be providing them a framework for goal setting. We want a real career pathway, a plan with an entry level job we understand in the beginning, but in the career path that they've chosen. Okay, next slide. Well, you know, one of the things that we had to do when we first were exposed to the concept of trauma-informed programming, and I really want to be specific about that, what we did is look at our projects and programs for reentry in the understanding of trauma. So it is not therapy that we offer. We're not qualified to do that. What we want to do is make sure we are aware. And that really does do what I said. It really requires a gut check. Looking at not just the training that you do for your staff, but the entire package. So we believe that you should train all staff, including others who might be visiting your offices, that this is the way we operate and we do that for the benefit of the customer. We also found that changing the office setting some, making it more open, is confined, but we also believe in providing privacy corners where if a person does need to have quiet time, they can go. We need to look at any workshops that we're doing and the structure we develop them in, how the classroom is set up, and the overall environment that's best for learning. Employment opportunities need to be customized according to the assessments that were done. But important, too, is a site visit with the participant before the interview and then ongoing visits after placement. And this is important because many times, if you've developed a sound relationship with the participant, that coach can go to that place of employment with them and they can have an honest conversation about any triggers that might be involved in working in that environment. And then after that, it doesn't stop. If we're doing a career pathway and assisting them in moving on that pathway, then we need to be always going back and looking at more. And like Craig said, we need to work with our employers. We can begin with you could with your own board members. You can expand that education to our chambers of commerce or other employer organizations. And we are very fortunate in Tarrant County to have numerous social services providers and nonprofits who've made the commitment to trauma-informed programming. Everyone from our local YMCA to several larger nonprofits located in Tarrant County. So it is something that we understand in the social services field, but employers may not understand. Next slide. What we talked about through here is remembering that this is the participant's journey. It's not the coach's journey. It's not the manager's journey. It's really not even the employer's journey. It's the journey that participant is going to be taking, so they decide what the destination is. And that's what we believe the coaching model does for us, is to remember that we don't set the expectation. the customer sets the expectation. And really, if this is something that you're interested in, especially if you serve people coming out of prison, if you've never been to a prison and yet you serve people who are in prison, I would suggest a visit. I know that that's a little hard to think about for some people, but if you're going to be assisting someone coming out of prison and transitioning into a normal life, which means the grocery store and the bus and eventually that place of employment, you really need to understand the environment they've come out of, especially those individuals who are going to be coaching. Because if they're going to be coaching, they need to understand the kinds of trauma that person could be exposed to that the customer may not even realize. So we believe that this new methodology, this combination of assessment and coaching with an emphasis on trauma-informed programming is what works best for us. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Debbie. Hi, everybody. This is Chris Warland of National Initiatives, and we have some questions for our panelists that have come in through the webinar. If you would like to ask a question, you're welcome to continue to type those questions into the question box in the right-hand panel there in the webinar screen. So the first question that we have, I think, might be something that we could open up to all of our panelists. This is the first question that rolled in, and I don't know that perhaps Craig might be the person who would be best equipped to answer, because Larkin Street does operate something like a social enterprise employment, but I think that anybody who has insight can answer. And that question is, what is the best way to be trauma-informed when dealing with media coverage of social enterprises and participants in the social enterprises? Has anybody experienced any media coverage of their work, and has that resulted in a need to take a trauma-informed approach?
This is Craig. I have, and I can address a bit of this question. So, you know, when you are working in this field and you're working to make such big improvements in young people's lives, and you end up working a lot with city government and with, you know, other organizations that actually want to gain more attention to, you know, the issue of, you know, homelessness or at risk of homelessness, and really embettering people, you'll definitely find the media is present. And one of the things we do, if the media is ever trying to connect on site with us or meet with our young people in person, interview, etc., we make sure that the opportunity is put out there, but every young person's participation is voluntary. You know, it's really about saying, like, this is not an expectation for anybody to have to do or have to be engaged in. And in fact, you know, if we have media in the area and they haven't really worked with us to establish why they're there or what they're doing, we definitely, you know, ask them to move along or to maybe be redirected to our manager of communications, who does handle kind of our external communication with media. With regard to our work teams who are out on the street and engaged in that sort of work, you know, we do talk to them before they come on, that they understand we're going to be in public. And because we're in public, there's going to be things outside of our control. And we want to make sure that they're very aware of that, so that they can not necessarily expect the unexpected, but that they've had sort of the groundwork laid, so that if something does come up, like a news reporter shows up saying, how do you feel about, you know, working and cleaning up the streets and gaining experience, our staff can then intervene, but then we can have a conversation with that young person to address, you know, the kind of the scares that can come from being put on the spot like that. But we also really emphasize that when we're going to be on the street, that we can't control everything, because there are other things that can happen. You know, there could be a car accident, there could be, you know, a conflict between people, you know, and in those cases, what we do is we make sure to take the young people's safety into consideration first. The young people on every one of our crews that are off and out in the city doing work know that if the crew leader, so our staff, says, "Hey, we got to go," we jump in the van and we get away from that block. If there's something related to violence that's going on, if there's somebody who's engaged in behavior that could be traumatizing to young folks or triggering, whether that be somebody who's publicly intoxicated or again, the media coming in and speaking on a particular subject, we want to make sure that they have an out should they need that out, and that everybody realizes that we're going to take their personal information, we're going to take their personal safety, and we're going to take their personal interests as a priority over everything else.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. We've got a lot of good questions rolling in. The next question that we received is for James. Folks in the field are talking about poverty as inducing prolonged trauma. Would you agree with this, given the definition of trauma as being sudden? So we mentioned that trauma was a sudden event. However, poverty is widely regarded as being traumatizing over the long term. So we're going to address that.
So I think absolutely we count poverty as something, Heartland Alliance in general, we are an anti-poverty organization, and we definitely consider poverty to be something that is traumatizing to people. If you just think about a lot of the conditions that come along with poverty, there's a lot of deprivation involved. There's heightened risk of other types of traumatic events to occur. So yes, while typically traumatic events are thought of as something that kind of happen in a sudden moment, when people are deprived on an ongoing basis repeatedly over and over, that deprivation is the same type of traumatizing state, especially when we talk about youth. And youth are particularly susceptible to being traumatized by neglect. And so not having basic needs met, including not having enough access to food, not having access to healthcare services when people are sick, those types of events over time, collectively are definitely something that can be traumatizing for people.
All right, thanks, James. Let's see, we have another question here that I think is kind of related. It says, do you or your organizations change any of your strategies when working with participants experiencing historical trauma? Anyone can go ahead and jump in if you've got a perspective on that.
I'm sorry, could you restate that question?
Yeah, sure. And this, I don't know exactly what the asker of the question, I don't have a definition of historical trauma, but do your organizations change any of your strategies when working with participants experiencing historical trauma?
So I think in general, when we're talking about historical trauma, that to me usually means one of a few things. One, it could refer to kind of the impact of intergenerational trauma. And so that's sort of how trauma can be passed from one person onto their children and so on from there. I think in that sense, we didn't, I think a few of us mentioned briefly the ACEs study, so Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And I think that's just worth mentioning here for people who aren't familiar with it, as something that gives us evidence that shows that when people are exposed to abuse and neglect at an early age, it increases the likelihood that they experience other problems later in life, such as serious chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance use disorder. And so all of those experiences later in life are things that can then become ACEs for their children. So for instance, having a parent experiencing a mental illness or a parent who gets incarcerated, the risk of those things increases someone's likelihood for trauma. I would say, the other thing in terms of, besides just intergenerational trauma, sometimes when people talk about historical trauma, they're talking about, the trauma happening to a group of people or a generation of people. And so we might think about that now in terms of the context of refugees and refugees coming out of, for instance, Syria, and kind of the collective experience that they have. And I think, in general, the principles and the philosophy stay the same. But I think one thing that Craig did a really good job of is talking about how, what is going to be helpful for one person is not always helpful for the next person. And so it's about really tailoring our solutions to what is most helpful for that person. So the same principles apply of safety and connection and control, but what it looks like definitely takes on a different shape depending on what situation that person's coming from and what their own personal experiences are. And I think that goes along with the idea of cultural humility, especially if we're not familiar with the culture that people are coming to us from, that we really try to help keep ourselves open to learning from them about what resources are going to be helpful there. Especially, we might have our own personal experiences we come with, and obviously we all have experience doing the work, but I think especially when we're not as familiar with the culture that someone comes to us with, we really need to be kind of open to hearing what they think will be most helpful. And so there are specific supports in terms of something like refugees. There are specific supports for communities based on, what country they come from, the types of experiences they've had. And so I would try to tailor and seek out those specific resources with that person in those situations. I don't know if anyone else wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I guess the only comments I would have is that we're going to address every young person as if they have historical trauma, as well as recent trauma, because we're not going to know until we have the ability to have that conversation with them and really weed out what they need from us. And so, with homelessness, as James was pointing out, and when we're talking about historic trauma, generally, if somebody's found themselves in a domestic abuse relationship, in a homeless situation, in a historically impoverished community, or et cetera, that's usually a sign that there has been a longer history. We actually find that, it's a pretty small percentage of people who were, doing great, did the I guess, cultural normative high school, college, after college, got the job, and then were laid off and then found themselves homeless. It's usually much more rare that occurs than it is that there's been a longer term history of what's been going on to cause that trauma.
Okay, thanks
Debbie,
very much.
I would agree with, I was just going to say, I would agree with Craig that we anticipate that anyone coming out of prison has very likely been exposed to one form of trauma or another.
All right, thanks. I will just mention really quickly, we've gotten a lot of questions coming through the question box about slides being available. The answer to that is yes, we will make the slides for today's webinar available on our website, as well as a recording of the webinar. And so at the end of the webinar, we'll also let you know one more time what the URL for national initiatives is, so you can access all of those materials as soon as we can get them posted. We also, I'll mention really quickly, we're getting a lot of really good questions, and we probably will not have time in the next 10 minutes to get to all of them, but we will endeavor to get all of the questions answered by our panelists and provide them to attendees via follow-up email as well. I do have one question now for Debbie. This question is, in Tarrant County, how did you offer staff training, an outside agency or train the trainer?
Well, we were really lucky that our mental health organization that we were contracting with several years ago made the decision that anyone involved with their particular programs needed to give training, intensive training on trauma-informed programming, and they brought us together. I was able to actually take frontline staff to the training, and now we have numerous providers throughout Tarrant County who are excellent at training. So it wasn't necessarily a workforce development project. It was a community project. It continues to be. That's the other exciting part about working with your local providers, is that you find there are all kinds of great resources, and they're willing to share and want to share, because at the end of the day, they know that we're going to be working with many of their participants, and so they want to make sure that if they're referring people into one of our projects, that we're aware of signs and symptoms of trauma, and our staff are ready and prepared to assist that participant.
Great, thanks. All right, we have another question here. And I think that anybody could answer this. Can you advise on best practices for handling staff turnover in a trauma-informed manner?
Well, I think staff turnover is inherent in social services. And many times that person may leave and go to a different nonprofit. But I believe you have to have consistent training, and it's another area where we're very fortunate in the assessment piece of it, because we do work with a licensed therapist who does ongoing training. So if people come in, we know that that person will be trained in best practices.
Yes,
I think
similarly. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Craig.
I was just going to say, we have to be able to acknowledge that staff turnover is a frequent occurrence in social services, whether it be because, individuals coming out of college seek this work to build experience and then often pursue a master's or a similar line of employment with a different focus. And really what we try to make sure that we're doing is that young people and the people we serve are being informed as soon as possible about somebody's transition, but we try to allow the staff member making the transition to have those conversations with folks. So what we'll often say is like, after you've told your team, please really concentrate on telling the young people that you work with or the clients that you work with, so that they don't feel like one day you were here and then you were gone and abandoned again. And it's a hard conversation to have, and we always try and make sure that they have support if they need to speak to their current supervisor about how to have that conversation with the clients that they work with. But at some point, you have to realize you won't be able to speak to everybody, and that in that case, then we make sure that the supervisors and the team, the colleagues that are still left after somebody transitions, are ready to be able to say, instead of just going, oh, they're gone, or oh, they don't work here anymore, being able to say, hey, this person was given an opportunity to do something else and they decided to take it. They usually, we ask them to just convey a general, they wanted to try and get everybody they could to be able to inform them that they were moving on, but they unfortunately couldn't reach everybody, excuse me, if that's one of the people that hasn't been able to be reached, hey, do you want to talk about it? Is there somebody else that you connected with that you feel like you'd be able to have a conversation with about this person's transition? Or, if you're just needing something from that person, how can I help you? That kind of approach.
I think I agree with what everyone else has said. I just would add, we should take into account that the level of support and how trauma-informed we are with our staff does have an impact on the level of turnover. Some amount of turnover is inevitable no matter where we are, but I think a common reason why a lot of people end up leaving one program or another is they don't feel totally supported. And so I think that support comes in terms of resources that foster self-care, but also the most basic support, which is, salary. And I think that's something worth acknowledging, is part of how service providers establish their own sense of safety in doing this work is not worrying that if, they are going to work at this social service agency, that they're going to be at risk of homelessness or poverty themselves, but that they actually have a job that provides a living wage. And so I think even the most basic supports like a living wage can help to kind of be a protective factor against that turnover and secondary trauma.
Excellent, thanks. I think we have time for one final question. And this is a question that got asked a few different times. in some cases directed to Craig, and in other cases more generally. I think that Debbie might have some insight on this as well. But it's about messaging to employers and training for employers, which I know Larkin Street does, around trauma-informed principles and how that can help employers support a successful relationship. So what can we do to message to employers and educate employers about responding positively to workers who have experienced trauma?
Well, I think that for us, it's having a good relationship with the employer in the beginning. In our workforce system, we have job developers, employment coaches, whose job it is to get to know the employer. And we also have at our board level a business services unit, and making sure they're informed about the participants that we're working with, and giving them general information and training on all of this is one way I think we can keep employers in the know. I think the best thing that we can do for employers is really not get real tied up in jargon or in things that we find fascinating in social work, but instead remember that this is an employer who owns a business or manages a business and is very busy and respectful of their time. So I think it's a fine balancing act. And quite frankly, I don't do that. That's why we have quality business service staff. And so my job is to make sure they're informed. And so as they work with employers, they can keep them informed as well.
Similarly, and I stated a little bit of this in my presentation, I work with young people and my staff and employers to try to have everybody on the same page. And what I'll reemphasize that Debbie even said was, we make sure that the employers know that they're gonna work with our youth. I mean, it's inevitable, this is the population that employers are employing, especially with regard to entry-level positions. So the kind of question and the key point of the conversation is do you want to know you're working with a young person who has these struggles, and do you also want to have support with that, or do you simply just want to have a chance of you don't have any idea that they have these struggles and that they have support for them, but if you want to work with us, we'll make sure that not only do you understand how to work with this young person, but we're also going to try and address some of the struggles that come up should they have an immediate housing need, or have an immediate basic need, or have an immediate professional development need. And in fact, because we're able to provide this service, and because we're able to address these issues as they come up for your employees, that it gives us a better opportunity to serve, again, more like an employment referrer rather than a service center, because we can say, here is, person number A, or person A, they have this level of skill. This is where we've experienced their particular strengths, their particular weaknesses, and here are their certificates, here are their resume, etc. Now, if you decide to move along with this person, we maybe be able to fund an internship, or we may be able to just serve as a reference. But should something come up, should they have attendance issues, should they have travel issues, should they have housing issues, if you inform us, and we kind of agree to this right now by getting the young person to sign a release of information, we can take steps to jump in on that should something occur, so that you don't lose an employee for something that's out of their control. And that way you don't have to do the whole training process again, and you don't have to kind of go through the whole hiring world again. Because the fact of the matter is you may end up having to do that anyway, because if we don't refer person A to you, then you might just hire person A based on the work that we've already done with them. You just won't have an opportunity to know what support they need.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for the great questions. Thanks to the presenters for answering them. It's a little bit after 1 in Chicago here, so we're gonna have to wrap things up. As Chris mentioned, the recording and slides will be up on our website shortly. We'll also be emailing them to everyone registered for the webinar. We'll also try to answer any questions that weren't addressed today via email as well. We have the speaker contacts up on this slide, and yeah, so you'll have these emailed to you. Yeah, the slides will be up on our website. That's the URL. You can also download our free toolkits at the National Initiatives website. And yeah, here's a slide with some of the National Initiatives contact information. We hope you'll keep in touch. So please feel free to email us, check out our e-news, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, all of that. And then finally, next month, we'll have our 4th installment in our webinar series on employment services for immigrants. It'll be May 18th at 1 p.m. Central Time. So mark your calendars and keep your eyes out for more information on this and other upcoming national initiatives resources. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us today.
I'm going to log off now. Thanks, everyone.